Hey, good morning, Professor Tootle.
Good morning. How's it going?
I'm doing really well. Another friend, a question that another friend has asked me is, John, you still optimistic? After seeing all this stuff that Trump's come out with the first month. And I didn't answer that question. I answered a couple other questions about the presidency, but the answer is I am still optimistic. I'm not particularly pleased with the president. I think it's chaos, like you said it would be. But I am actually still optimistic, and all my more liberal friends want me to be doom and gloom, and he's a dictator, and see this, and see that, and see the other thing almost every day. See that, see that. Isn't he a dictator? Isn't it a coup? And I'm still not there yet. I know you're probably even less than me, or has it changed in the last 2 weeks since we've met?
Well, I was thinking as you were talking, I was wondering if that's just a function of our age, you know? Like, in other words, the older I get, the shorter 4 years seems.
Yeah,
You know,
could be.
like now that I'm in my 50s, like, can I survive until I'm 54? And it's like, well, I think I can, you know?
Yeah,
And
it's
so
interesting that
it's
you
not
said it
that
was age.
I'm not so it's like I'm optimistic about what? You need to be more specific. But like, do I think
Well,
I'll make it till I'm 54? The answer is yes.
Well, that no, that our democracy is ended. My liberal friends think it's a coup already. It's happened right in front of our eyes, John, and you're not paying enough attention. He is a dictator. It has happened, and what are you doing about it? And I'm trying to do a lot about it, as you know. I think you know, but
I
I'm
just
not thinking it's a coup. He runs. He's the president. He's firing staff. Shocking.
Yeah, it's just that I don't think it's funny because I have we've talked so many times on previous shows about how the what the destruction of culture and the destruction of history has done to our culture. There's still something in Americans that still watches movies and knows good guys from bad guys.
Oh my God, you're getting to my theme already. Good.
And I think that when it comes to, you know, the direct moment, let's say, when uh, when we're confronted as with something undeniable, that I'm trying to think of what that would be like if Trump were to try to nationalize police forces or you know what I mean, something on that, like that's when we get on the phones and we start calling like, hey, you're my cousin, like we got 500, and that's when I just if it got that bad, I still have faith that the American people would rise up and say, like, no, you've crossed the line here.
Well, I completely agree. But don't you think there are some indications now, and this is not the topic, by the way, we're going to go back to what you
Right.
hinted in a second, but don't you think there there's some indications that he has some kind of loyalty oath going on in
Yeah.
addition to swearing to the Constitution? And that loyalty oath has gone way deeper into administrations and independent agencies than I would have imagined. Isn't that probably going on?
Yes, but if our previous experiences are any indication, the one thing that has saved us is, and it's a double-edged sword, but is that Trump is also incompetent, and he mostly hires incompetent people. And the fact that he's got some competent people working for him this time um, doesn't mean that those second and third layer people have any idea what they're doing. I mean, they're file, it reminds me a little bit of stuff that was going on during the elections, where once you get, I mean, even with the election stuff, like he couldn't even get good lawyers at the top, but now he's got some semi-competent people at the very top. But just below those people are guys who would and gals who would, fill out court briefings in crayon, like they don't even know how to do things. And Trump's incompetence often prevents him from doing things. But that doesn't mean that the chaos doesn't have horrible consequences. But
Yeah, I mean,
anyway,
there's real federal employees that are losing their jobs, and some of them it's
yeah,
really
and
inappropriate.
UN votes on Ukraine, which I'm sure we're going to bring up, and
Yeah.
the Department of Justice, uh, not prosecuting Trump friends and prosecuting anyone he perceives as an enemy. And I mean, you just go from department to department, and it's reward friends and punish enemies, and critical Trump theory is running amok.
And that, and, did you just brand that as a brand, or have you been talking
Well,
about that?
I guess I first heard Jonah Goldberg say it,
Ah, Jonah. Yeah.
but I've been thinking about it ever since, and I don't know if it's out there in the ether, but I do think that it's sort of ironic that Trump, you know, brands himself as somebody who goes after DEI and critical theorists and whatever, when that's really what they are. You know, it's you take one premise and reason everything from that one premise. And to the so because I ascribe no consistency to Trump other than whatever the last thing that came out of his mouth you're not allowed to disagree with. But that's what critical theory is. You know, you take one premise and you see everything through that lens. So it is. I've had a lot of interesting conversations over the past few weeks with friends of mine who are all over the, you know, political, many different political perspectives. And one thing that's sort of coming through is that uh, the governing principles of both parties are the same, even though the issues are different. and um, eh,
Well, you lost me there for a second. What? Say that again.
the governing principles of all politicians are essentially the same. You know, I'd say like 430 people out of the United States Congress, um, or as actually Sarah Isgur put it a different way, um, there is no Hamilton party anymore. That it's just a bunch of Jeffersonians with no opposition. That
You mean populists, or you mean what?
Yeah, but that's what I mean. The to go back to American history, like the original sort of divide is about um, uh, how you rank or how you order the founding principles. And even at the time of the founding, there was this divide between Jefferson and Hamilton, or you could say Washington and Adams, and uh, to a lesser extent. I mean, Adams kind of split the divide, but between people who said, well, what really has to happen is we need to care more about the voice of the people, and the government needs to be the agent of creating social change. You know, that government can change culture.
The
Uh,
Jeffersonians.
yeah, the Jeffersonians, and that,
Okay.
you know, essentially that was the kind of core of the Democratic Party, and it evolved into Jacksonian democracy. And you're just like, okay, or if you don't, if you're uncomfortable saying we're all that they're all Jeffersonians now, how about this? They're all Jacksonians now. They're all people who say, well, whatever my political supporters want, that's good, and whatever the opponents want, that's bad, and that's it. I don't need to. There's no other principle involved in deciding good or bad policy other than reward friends, punish enemies, and the people who I define as good, I'm going to shove through their policies, and I'm not going to care about the rights of unpopular minorities. The only difference is who they consider the unpopular, you know, who's the unpopular minority to them, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Well, that's kind of depressing. So I'm not going to let you keep going down that
oh,
path any
sorry, our topic
So
for
that's on our elected
yeah.
officials in Congress. That's not talking about Americans or America, although they may be a reflection of it.
Yeah,
Um,
well, I think it's probably of, I mean, some of it's institutional as a result of the evolution of the primary system, and some of it's, you
mhm.
know, media, and some of it's educational institutions, and you know, it's all the things that make up American history and culture contribute to that evolution. But
Well,
I
we got to have some more Shanes in Congress, is what you're saying. Call me Shane, that little novella. Somebody will stand up and do the right thing, even if he's had a bad past. You just,
yeah. Or just, you know, I watched some interviews with George Bush over the past, George W. Bush over the past couple of weeks. And there was one that he must have done at some forum uh, some public statements. And I just think, some of what he said is unpopular, but in every case, it was, I'm going to, tell the truth. Just this is going to make you happy. This is going to make you sad, but this is what's best for the country as a whole. And it's some of it's going to please my former supporters, and some of it isn't. But it's going to be based on a candid survey of all the facts, and I'm not going to just start with the premise of rewarding friends and punishing enemies, and then whatever flows from that is what I will defend.
Well,
For instance, I'll just give you a tiny little example. There was some congressman, I think she's from Illinois or something, and she started going after Elon Musk for being an immigrant.
right,
And you're like, all right, and saying he has no right to speak on these issues because he's only been here for a few years,
right,
and you're just like, and the fact that everybody who hates Elon Musk is like, yeah, right on, without seeing the irony of this at all.
right.
Um,
Yeah,
so
that is it is clear that it depends on who the audience or who the author is, who the speaker is, then they judge everything based off that. Really, we have got to get back to, I don't know, Justin Amash was really good at
Well,
this. And
I'm just saying, like, how about just the principle? If you truly believe that, like, I don't know, tell me what you actually believe about immigrants and their integration into the American body politic, and then just act accordingly.
yeah,
You know,
it,
act according to that belief you say that you profess about the integration of immigrants integrating into the larger political system of America. Like,
okay. You've
anyway.
given me a second handhold to get to the
Sorry.
topic
Well, that was me
today.
three shows for a minute.
And
Yeah.
it's always my fault
Yeah.
for letting us go astray. I'm the moderator, so when we're astray, that's my fault, not yours. So the handhold is this. Um, Tell us what you think. Um, cool. What is the difference between, and not on immigration per se, but on a broader topic, what is the, well, let me just say it. What does it mean to be an American professor in 2025 or in 1885? What does it mean to be an American? Or maybe it doesn't mean anything anymore. And I have some concern that it may not. But can you give us a historical approach? And you can start from the founding or you can
Yeah.
start from current. Just what does it mean to be an American?
It means, first, let me say it means something to me, right? And
Thank
I
you.
take my definition of what it means to be an American from, uh, how Lincoln formulated it, how, even though I disagree with some later Jefferson, how Jefferson formulated it, and how Jefferson summarized what it meant to be an American, which is, um, the United States of America is an ideological nation state, meaning
Okay, hold on. Let me stop you right there.
okay.
How many other ideological nation states are there in 2025 around the world? And don't worry about the exact number, but
Yeah, I really don't know. I mean, I would guess that, at the time of our founding, there were zero,
okay.
but
Uh,
now I guess I would need to really put some thought into this. And for instance, what does it mean to be an Englishman in the year 2025, or a New Zealander? And in many ways, um, modern democratic nation states have followed our example of creating some combination of principles with history, usually, to I mean, I would just say that, like, almost everything we would call a democracy now, or that has some scheme of real representation without the threat of violence, is probably, I would call, an ideological nation state now.
okay, but distinguish it. And I know you're going to get more into our definition. So sorry to be rude, but I don't think people understand this conversation. So I'm trying to interrupt myself to make sure I understand. Is Iran, is that an
No,
ideological nation state?
no.
Why not? It's what the Shah says, or whatever
Yeah,
the.
yeah. For one thing, you are not free. So that one of the things is that in order to in order have to have a society based on ideas, you have to be free to hold those ideas. You know, you at the very least, you have to have the right to not be um, killed. Or let me put it another way: it's certainly based on ideas, but we have no idea. Well, I guess we have some idea, but we can't really know what the Iranian people believe until you have some way of peacefully translating their will into a decision, and they don't have that right now. So uh, you could say there are people in Iran who have ideas and they are imposing those ideas on the rest of society. Um, as and in a way, is it a nation state? Well, it is Persian, it is Shia, uh, um, and if you're one of the sort of second class minorities within Iran, um, the I guess you could say, well, they're just not really part of the nation state of Iran. It's an Islam, so
Okay, let
I
me
would say
try
no, but
one more
there are a lot
one
of
more
countries in
question
the
then.
world. So.
Japan. We don't think of Japan as a Western uh, free democracy, do we? It would be categorized as something different. But is Japan a ideological nation state?
I think so, at least, but I mean, there are some cultural elements of Japan that uh, are just beneath the surface. In other words, it's very difficult to imagine somebody who is not of Japanese heritage actually leading the Japanese government.
Wait,
So,
wait, wait. What do you mean very? It's impossible. Why would you say very difficult? It's impossible.
well, I guess never say never, but
Oh no, it's never. In their
but I would
instance,
I
it's
don't
never.
think no, right, but my point is like I don't think there's anything in their legal system that is preventing that from happening. I just think that it's such a deep cultural value, and there is, and I mean, I hate to say stuff like this because it makes me, I don't know, it's sound uncomplimentary about a country that is,
No doubt.
by and large, uh, not number one on my hit list of evil countries, but they don't exactly treat non-Japanese people the way they treat Japanese people. It's not
I thought it was actually legal, not just cultural, but maybe I'm wrong.
yeah, I don't know. We could look that up, but I, I don't know.
Okay. So I've given you two examples, and our topic today is actually Russia and Ukraine. But in order to understand Ukraine and Russia, I figure it's important to kind of understand Americans a little bit more. So I
Can I
interrupted you.
return to the
You said
original question though, because I
an
never answered
ideological
it.
nation state. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. So the historical basis for an ideological nation state, that when the United States was founded, we are the ideas people government, right? That what when you're thinking about who are Americans, you say Americans are the people who believe these things, right? Who are the we? We are the ones who hold these truths to be self-evident, right? And that and then from what you get from Lincoln and certain founders is the idea that the purpose of the Constitution was always to enact the ideals of the Declaration. That the if you want to know what the Constitution means, you look at the Declaration, and you can't see those two documents as being contradictory from one another, right? Um, uh, and that because we have free political institutions with representation, that Americans are constantly deciding uh, to re-up as Americans, because as Ronald Reagan, I think, once said, although I've never been able to track down the quote, lower the fences and see which way people run. And in other words, America is not a prison, and uh, so the definition of an American is somebody who believes in the ideals of the Declaration. And then I always throw in Peter Schramm, the found one of
Hold,
the
hold on, hold on. Before you go to that, let me emphasize. I've read the Declaration, oh, at least a half a dozen times, conceivably dozens of times, but a half a dozen times. most of it is just a long grievance list against the king. So, isn't it? I mean, isn't it just it's a long list of transgressions or evil or whatever, the things they didn't like about the king, isn't it?
Yes,
Okay.
but
When you say the king,
but as Lincoln said, the inclusion of those ideals was most happy and fortunate because without them, as well as with them, we could have declared our independence. But with them, it becomes the engine of the only things that will ever entwine themselves more closely about the human heart. And that's the only thing that will ever give human beings enterprise uh, and industry. It's the only thing that will ever make people able to dream about a better life for themselves because with it or without it, but it's like the that people will not fight and endure for a mere change of masters. You're not going to fight for a new slave master, right? So, um, as Lincoln said, yes, you're right. That is what's most of it. But it also includes this statement that Thomas
preamble.
Jefferson said was meant to be read literally. If people think, oh, they didn't really mean it. Yes, they did. They actually meant it, and he was trying to put it in, as he later said, in terms so plain and firm as to command their assent, meaning I'm trying to be as literal as possible so nobody could ever misunderstand what I mean when I say all men are created equal. And that was the common sense of the subject that every single person agreed that the natural state of a human being was to be free. And the question always pops up of, well, he didn't mean black people, did he? And the answer is yes, he did, because in his original draft, he called black people men, persons, and he specifically called slavery a market where men are being bought and sold, and he called them persons and he called them people. So Thomas Jefferson absolutely did. And then you say, well, what about Native Americans and women? You say, well, at the time of the founding, there were some states that let Native Americans vote, and there were some states that let women vote. And so when you're talking about who was it who actually created the United States of America, you don't get to leave women out. You don't get to leave Native Americans out, and you don't get to leave black people out. But it means that there is a process of determining um, how schemes of representation in the law works, but that in every age it's going to be imperfect, and it's after we let more people vote that black people, women, Native Americans started losing the right to vote as we expanded who could vote. So just like if I was a woman or a black person, I would say there might be some downside to um, populism and democracy running amok, because what it leads to is the punishing of unpopular minorities as defined by a politics of reward friends, punish enemies, um, and whatever my side wants is the right thing to do. Um, and I think that the real shame of it is that there doesn't seem to be anybody representing the sort of opposite view that maybe we should take things like rule of law and the protection of rights and at least have somebody in the room arguing that maybe we shouldn't do this, that we shouldn't just use the political system at every level to reward friends, punish enemies, and do whatever we want.
Okay, boy, you've covered a lot there. I pulled three words out of that. Let me see if I've missed them or got them right. I heard peace. Oh, first I heard freedom. Then I heard peace. Then I heard like rules based methodology or a system of building up a society. I refer to it as rule of law, but I heard that come out too. What else have I missed besides freedom, peace, and some kind of rules based rather than power based or populist based? You're going into your pantry?
Yeah, I keep this in my pantry. Uh,
Well, I've never seen your pantry before. This is kind of interesting.
yeah, yeah. Here, well, I'll close the door here. Let's see. Natural and alienable rights, liberty, equality, justice, majority rule, minority rights, consent of the governed, democracy, republic, rule of law, due process, separation of powers, checks and balances, federalism, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, press and assembly, and private property rights. How about that?
Wait, what is that?
That's just an insert from the Bill of Rights Institute on the founding principles of the United States, but I'm always afraid because there are so many that I'm going to leave something out. And so I literally put it in my pantry.
I just love that. Will you take a picture of that and send that to me, please?
Yeah,
Just no, on your phone after the show. Take a
yeah,
picture of it.
okay. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. So, Professor, many of my younger friends say that there isn't much difference between us and other countries. We're all citizens of the world. We're humans. We and we've got to respect humans wherever they are. And I get that. I actually do agree that we're all humans. But I don't know if they, and I don't mean to be critical of younger generations. I'm not even sure I am critical. It's just I don't know if they can articulate. In fact, I might do this as an experiment. Take my phone out and video people just walk along downtown Denver or a mall somewhere and say, "Hey, what does it mean to be an American?" Occasionally, comedians do that, and you get all the silly answers. And I don't want to do it to put people on the spot and make them feel bad. And I'd actually block out most of those because I don't, we all say stupid stuff, or we all don't know because some guy walks up to you on the street. I want to kind of do it and find the little nuggets of interest, of, well, that's an interesting point, that are undiscovered. Do you have an instinct of whether how many people would agree with you on what you just described about being an American? You said originally when we started this program that it would be universal. Americans figure out the right thing eventually from watching old movies, or we kind of know what's right and just versus what's not, what's good versus evil. Can you give a sense of where we are culturally as Americans?
Well, I think it's really hard to undo uh 400 years of culture, but it's you can do a lot of damage in 40 years, you know. And what we've seen over the past 40 years is uh, a decline in the teaching of those principles. And I mean, essentially, the problem becomes what do you do when you have the wrong heroes? And in other words, think about everybody you know. How many of them, if you just asked, is George Washington a hero of yours? And how many of them would say yes? And how many of them would say, well, he owned slaves, so he's not my favorite, But the whole point is that you need to understand that George Washington needs to be your hero. And the reason why he's number one is precisely because he did not want to be king. That's a big deal. And so if you aren't teaching kids that your hero should be the one who didn't want to be king, and that's the first thing. Then when President Trump posts a picture of himself as a king with "Long live the king," you won't think it's either A, a hilarious joke, or B, want any of your leaders to be kings. But
Friend or foe?
yeah, right. You don't want Obama to be king, and you don't want Trump to be king. You don't want anybody to be king. So there's a cost when when you don't teach the basics. You know, everybody always wants to, oh, do you not want to say that he owned slaves? Like, no, I want to say that, I want to, yeah, absolutely. But, but, but if you aren't aware of what a big deal it is in the course of human history for somebody to say that human beings can govern themselves peacefully, and they actually don't need a Caesar. Like, well, then your worldview is upside down,
Okay, this is really
or
helpful.
I'd just say, like, ignorant at best.
This is helpful. Would you concur then that the play Hamilton was a valuable contribution to younger
Absolutely.
generations?
Yes, absolutely. And
Okay.
I almost wonder, sometimes it's funny, I think, like, did that play maybe extend the life of the republic by 5 years?
Oh wow, you really?
Like, when the republic falls, will we look back and say, like, that play might have, like, given us 5 more years of representative government?
I'm so glad I asked. I had no idea you were such a
Yeah,
fan.
and the funny thing is I don't even like it, but,
Oh, I love it. Listen to it again. I love it.
I can't. I just don't like the style of rapping,
Oh,
but
well,
whatever. I love the book, and I will,
I'm
eh,
here to help
I will
you.
praise it to high heaven. And
Yeah, I'm
We've
still
had
here to
Steve
help you.
Don here a couple times, and
It
he,
is more amazing than you think. Watch it one more time with my eyes.
uh,
Take yourself out of it and just watch with John's joy.
okay. Well, it's hard for me to get through. Maybe I need to see it.
You can do it. I trust you.
But
Okay.
Steve Knott's gone through that play and written about this, and it is amazing that it contains only one major historical error, and
Wow. I didn't
and
know Steve Knott, Professor Knott
with
did that.
some there are some minor errors, but
Right.
there are also errors that were in the Chernow book. So, um, but
Interesting.
the
I got to
only
keep you on track. Hold on. I got to keep you on track.
yeah,
So,
sorry, we got to talk about Ukraine at some point, right?
yeah, yeah, right. But
Yeah.
before we get to Ukraine, tell me now culturally. I guess Russia had kings and queens, just like all the other countries in Europe had kings and queens. So you can go all the way back to that time, or you can go up to the revolution. But I don't care about historical dates for the purpose of this conversation. I care about culturally. The
Mhm.
Russian people are just like us, or just like France, or just like well, tell us about Russian history. You have a emphasis in your minor and PhD or
Yeah,
something.
yeah, yeah. I did a
Tell us.
field in Soviet history, yeah, and as a result, I did have to learn a little bit of Russian history, and certainly the guy I studied under is great, Steve Miner, beer prize winning historian. So, he's I mean, he's retired now, but he was a pretty big name in Soviet
So
and Russian.
educate us. I'm a kindergartner on Russia. So tell
So,
us.
well, I mean, Russia has a complicated history. What are you most interested in knowing? I
What
don't
I
know which
really
part.
want to know is what makes up the Russian psyche. My parents traveled there. They thought the people were delightful. It was a nice country. But what makes up when we get to Ukraine? Is there a difference between Americans and Russians? That's what I want to know.
Yes, and
Well, tell us.
there are also deep divides between. Um, I mean, actually, one of the most important points that go, if you want to go deep into Russian history, is that the intellectual class in Russia was literally a separate class of people. We use this word intelligentsia
Hmm.
in to mean sort of like, and we use the word class sort of loosely to mean like, oh, well, if you're a teacher, you went to grad school, or you're an intellectual, you're a member of this, the intelligentsia of America or something. But in Russian history, the intelligentsia was literally a class. I mean, it was a hard and fast group of people. And
Well, but isn't that the same as the kings and queens and their royal courts and all the other monarchy?
no, no, and that's why there are these elements of Russian culture that Russians can rightfully take tremendous pride in, and that's also why the high art in Russia is just extraordinary. And again, I would just defer to people who are experts in things like painting and literature and stuff like that. But
Music, right?
yeah, music. I mean, they're just it's an incredible culture of high art. Um, as to like the regular Russian people, um, I found them to be mostly lovely in my experiences. But there is a deep sense of like tragedy and fatalism present in their culture that is not present in American culture. And again, we're speaking in generalities. And part of it leads into why uh, Putin would want Ukraine in the first place. You know, the origin, if part of your pride in being Russian comes from some idea of the restoration of Russian culture, well, the origin of Russian culture is the Kiev Rus, which is in Ukraine, so it's never
You're talking
going to.
about, I don't know that word, but a historic homeland? Is that what you?
Yeah, but the I think for many Ukrainians, and this is a sort of, and I'm generalizing, but so don't take this as far, and there are limits to what I'm about to say. But there is a feeling among many Ukrainians that we're the real Russians. That Moscow, based Russians are a bunch of pretenders, and but that they both see each other as like being sort of uh, like high culture Russians would view Ukraine as like a agricultural backwater, but Ukrainians would point to the origins of this culture, the Kiev Rus, as being the origins of uh,
So
not just Russian culture, but also in a way, linguists would also point out that like it's literally the origin of the Indo-European language. That the language group that spread as far as India and Ireland eventually is in that area too. So it's
well, Professor, when
there's a
you're describing
complicated history between that area, that region, and what we would call like Moscow and St. Petersburg for that reason. For that,
when you were describing that, it occurred to me, and so this is wrong, so I want you to get me on the right track again. I think it's wrong. Um, it would occur to me that this is the difference between a Hamilton and Jefferson. It's populist and I mean, it's like a human nature trait that there's elites and there's people. It's the major complaint from Democrats today that we're run in America by oligarchs. That there is this really high, it's a different class. It's a different type of people when you're a billionaire. They don't go to
Mhm.
the same grocery stores. They don't go to grocery stores. They don't go to the same resorts. They go to an island. It's a totally different world. And so I don't get the distinguishing characteristics between Russians and Americans, in other words. So I get the dourness or the sadness. I mean, there's a brutal history. What other country? I think there's one that kills millions of their own citizens. I mean,
Yeah,
that's a brutal history. So I get being dour on yourself. Is
yeah.
that
And my old history professor, Steve Miner, used to say that he always found American history to be sort of like, funny in that, you know, if whatever example that I would bring up in American history, he would bring up 1,000 examples that were 1,000 times bigger. Like for every and he would be like, you guys have a uh, you know, uh, some battle between colonists and native peoples, commemorated. And he was like, in Russia, that's just every place, always. And it was 10,000 times bigger, um, so he used to say that studying Russian history is like studying history in Technicolor, and then all other history sort of starts looking like a black and white cartoon,
well,
compared to.
give a bigger specific. Like, so there's been massacres in the United States history.
Yeah, but he's
India,
just like, yeah, in Russia, what we would call a massacre in the United States would be so insignificant that they wouldn't even know about it. And because the ones that they know about, there were 1,000 times more of them, and they were 1,000 times bigger. And they're
and
so big that even historians, we just skip them. Like even their historians, because it's too much.
well, give an example of one of the biggest. Then, how many people were wiped out in a revolution or a purge or whatever? What I don't even know what words we call them in history.
Well, that's the thing, is we don't have great records before the before the 20th century. But by the time we get into the 20th century, you're talking about a terror famine in Ukraine that was bigger than the Holocaust. you know, um, well, just how about this? Right now, I heard a report that oh, I just forgot the number. I think it's 20 something thousand children in Ukraine have been kidnapped and are being re-educated in Russian schools and trained to erase the history of Ukraine and then be put into the military to fight Ukraine. And they stopped keeping track because essentially the program got so big that they can't track anymore, even the Ukrainian government. So it could be as many as 1 million children. But so think about the gap between 26,000 and 1 million, and that's today. Right. and and that's just one thing that never even makes the news, and that's just the kidnapping of children just today. So yeah, but the idea that it's sort of the equivalent of the re-education of Native Americans, as just came through the chat, that's kind of the point, is that if you look at the what was done, the severity, the numbers, that what the Russians are doing today, what the Russians did last year dwarfs everything that America's in American history. And the Russians were doing it for 100 years, like, um, and in way larger numbers. That's kind of the point that my old professor was
We'll see if
making.
Jake can look up some of those numbers for us, or we can add them back later. So, Professor, I've always thought of American society as being fairly violent. I don't know, conquering the West and conquering, just becoming a country. And it seems like we have a lot of guns and we like to use them and stuff. And I think a lot of countries around the world kind of think we're violent prone. So I'm almost surprised you're telling me that, yeah, violent prone. Look at Russia. I mean, are they a violent part of our species too? I mean, or are we
So
all
just
violent?
all of human history was dictated by violence until the creation of the idea that
What?
you have
What?
universal human rights and the
Which is
creation
in
of
what document?
ideological nation states. So in a way, it's funny. We get sort of tagged as we be, as being, and again, this is kind of what's messed up about our teaching, because we're the people who first called it wrong and started tracking it. People assume that we're the worst at it, you know. But it's kind of like slavery had existed for all of human history, and the people who come along and end it somehow get the blame for starting it. That's bizarre, right? It was the ideals that human beings have rights that led to us ending slavery, and it's the ideals that you shouldn't use violence that led us to incentivize peace. And so it's, again, I would never advocate for not teaching the incidents of violence, but you always need to put those incidents of violence into the context of the reason we think this is bad is because we're the ones arguing that it's bad. And that shouldn't have happened, and that this is an example of something, of a behavior we don't want to repeat. It's not evidence that the system is bad. It's evidence that the system is good. Um, and that's a pretty important big idea. Uh, that
You can go ahead and answer that one too if it doesn't take you off
what is
track.
it? In the chat, a big point in my teaching about abolition, which is tricky to talk about. Africans sold Africans. Yeah, I, I mean, we shouldn't. We don't want to, again, overemphasize that, because then we're carrying the water for the racists who try to. I mean, and this is the hard part, right? I just got a book on the Salem, just a small. I'll make two little small points that kind of illustrated this, that came up in the last week. I just got a book on the Salem witch trials, and I would never argue that the Salem witch trials didn't happen, but the only reason we know about the Salem witch trials is because Southerners were trying to find examples of reasons why the North was not morally superior to the South. And they are the ones who popularized the stories about the Salem witch trials. And it was done in order to make the argument, well, who are you to tell us what we should be doing with our slaves? You're the ones who burn witches.
How many
Because
witches were burned? I mean, you haven't read the book, but how many
zero,
witches?
none of them were burned, but whatever. But that's kind of the point, that we think that they burned witches and we think it was this widespread thing, when really it was, I mean, one way of looking at this is that this is the kind of thing that was happening everywhere, and that rule of law is what put a stop to this practice. And the people of New England were embarrassed about it. Within a year, they are trying to bury it themselves, and they don't want anybody to find out about it. And they're, making sure to never repeat this process again. Whereas, people are killing witches for a long time in the rest of the world. So something that is actually an example of when this thing happened in this country, the people who did it had this process that they went through. And not only did they realize they used the best tools at their disposal, their court system, their legal system, their laws, but even after that, they were like, this was wrong. They were self-critical and they never did it again. But what happens to that story? Well, Southerners, in order to discredit the North, say this is what that we're going to publicize your human rights failure and teach it as a story of, you have no right to tell us that slavery is wrong because you guys burn witches. Even
Fascinating. So I've got us off track again. That
sorry,
was a really
back to
interesting
Ukraine. Yeah,
historical point.
sorry.
I want us to get back to Russia again because I still can't quite determine who has the moral, back to your analogy, who has the moral authority to help Ukrainians decide what they are. Are they Russians? Or are they, maybe the kids were
No,
Russian?
the Ukrainians do, and there's a long, complicated history, but it seems to be clear from the recent electoral history of Ukraine that the majority of Ukrainians envision themselves as a modern, prosperous country, integrated with the rest of the world, and they have the resources in order to make that a reality. And for Russians, the idea of a distinct Ukrainian identity is a threat to them. For the same reason, just the existence of the United States was a threat to all kingdoms, because if because Ukraine was successful at this, and so was Poland. And if you think about the success of Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, and then Ukraine, this continues to put pressure on the Russians, because everybody's looking at these people and saying, hey, look, why are all the Latvians doing so well? Why are the Lithuanians doing so well? Why are the Poles all doing so well? Why can't we have that here? And then if Ukrainians are doing so much better than the Russians, even though Putin does a very good job of controlling information within Russia, and we talked about that in a previous episode. I do have a friend who lives in Russia, and I sometimes I don't want to talk too much about
Yeah,
it
don't talk about it.
for risk, but my but I Putin does a very good job of controlling the information. But again, this kind of comes from both Russian history and the experience with the Soviets. Russians sort of know that Putin is lying, you know, but they don't really know what the truth is. Uh, but when they get examples of what's going on from other places, in every case, they're worse. And for a prideful people, it's embarrassing. And it it will continue to put pressure. It was continuing to put pressure. We have no idea how fragile Putin's government is. I think that the that march to Moscow that wasn't stopped by any Russians indicates just how fragile Putin's regime is. That that if there was any kind of military force, that the Russian people would not rise up in support of Putin in order to put it down. You know, they're a coup away from Putin being strung up by the nearest lamppost, and he knows that. So having a successful Ukraine on his border, even if they never did anything, would still threaten the security of not Russia, of Putin.
Professor, how, without numbers, because you don't have them in front of you, I would have asked you ahead of time if I wanted to know a real answer. The population of Russia or the GDP of Russia compared to America or Europe
Um, Russia would be, lower middle of the pack in
in
terms
population and
of, yeah,
GDP?
yeah. I mean, they are not an economic superpower. They're a small to medium uh, economic and military power.
So they've got
The only
nukes
thing they have is nuclear weapons. You
and
know,
they've got the willingness, either the threat and the threat of violence and the willingness to use violence. That's another distinguishing characteristic. Some countries don't want to be warmongers. They're willing to exert their power.
and the other thing that they have, I mean, they have this thing that North Korea has, is that they don't care about the lives of their citizens. So, I mean, that in its own way is
Their citizens are tools to accomplish whatever
the individual life of a Russian soldier is not something that they value particularly.
yeah, I think that's a distinct. I don't think you can say that about America. You can say
Oh,
that
no,
they're,
no, no. Our entire military doctrine is the opposite of that.
yeah,
You
every
know,
soldier means something.
whereas what was it? Patton said, "Your job is not to die for your country; it's to make that other poor dumb son of a bitch die for his."
Theirs.
Our military doctrine is the exact opposite of that.
Okay.
Uh,
Professor, you want us to engage as Americans and America like Reagan did with Gorbachev. Is that, would you like to go back to that time, peace through strength, and tear down this wall, get the hell out of Ukraine? Or do we need to form a strategic alliance with Russia like Trump does? Where are you on that kind of spectrum of ideas?
uh, are those my only two options?
Of
uh,
course not. You're the
uh,
professor. Give us
yeah,
your life.
I what would if I were a member of Congress, or uh, you know if I
No,
were Marco
you're
Rubio or something. I don't what
Toodle.
Who do you want me to imagine I am in this
You're
scenario?
President Toodle. How do we handle the Ukraine situation?
We give them um, uh, all of the weapons that they need in order to take back every inch, every spoonful of dirt taken by Putin, including Crimea, and we commit no American ground forces. But in addition to giving them the ability to take back all of their own territory, we give them the commitment that when they have done so, we will establish a no-fly zone over Ukraine and give them cybersecurity and naval and air superiority in order to free up their resources so that their soldiers can retake their land.
So
Um,
you thought President Biden was too hesitant, too
yeah,
reticent to go all
yep,
the way, and so now you're just like beside yourself on what happened with. I don't want you to have to come out directly against President Trump, but you must be beside yourself.
yeah. Well, I mean, I guess the reason I'm not beside myself is that's just sort of not my personality. But and the other piece of it is like I would be beside myself if I didn't expect it. Like I, I was upset at the Biden limitations on the Ukrainians, and I knew that when President Trump was elected, that it would be worse and more chaotic, and it would be immoral, and it would be both immoral, incompetent, bizarre, chaotic, uh, and
Don't you think a
capricious.
super majority
Especially,
of don't
like,
you think a super majority of Republican congressmen and senators are more akin to your position than President Trump's?
yes.
Okay, but for some reason, they just have to keep their mouth shut. So if you were Congressman Tootle now, you just have to keep your mouth shut, or otherwise you get
Because
primaried
they
and kicked
aren't
out.
really keeping their mouths shut, but and again, it's one of those like weird things that we haven't done a good job of educating the American people that you should really vote for president based on foreign policy, not domestic policy. Because the president has powers in foreign policy that he does not have in domestic policy. So, there are a lot of things that a congressman can do to influence the actual legislation. But in foreign policy, whatever comes out of his mouth today, that's the policy of the United States. And the fact that it's different than what he said yesterday is like, well, now we're watching, wipe clean off the whiteboard, and whatever he just said on Truth Social, that's the American foreign policy.
Yeah,
Um,
I disagree with that a little bit. I think it has to be filed as an executive order or a directive of some type. But we need to at some point we need to find out who's right on that, you or me. All right, Professor, we haven't been quite as pointed as I wished to be. Is so before we get to questions, particularly Ray, before we get to questions, is there something like, hey, John, you didn't guide us to the right damn path? If you want to understand world situation right now, it's really not America, Russia, because Russia's a small player. It's really Ukraine, just for the principle of humans wanting to control their own destiny. We should do that all around the world. I mean, like, is there some main thrust that I have not taken us to that we should have been to?
well, there's certainly, it sounds like I'm understating it in one way. There's a downside to having incompetence uh, um, um,
You're not
and
going to get a cabinet appointment if you keep going this way.
well, I just like there are just bad consequences for American foreign policy all over the world. I mean, from every bizarre, incompetent trade agreement that isn't being signed. It's funny. I heard David French this morning say that he had spent his entire legal, not his entire, but he spent a great portion of his legal career trying to make sure that the government wasn't discriminating against Christian organizations that were involved in um, relief efforts.
Mhm.
And after all those battles, like Trump has killed every Christian relief organization. And he's like, if Joe Biden did this, this would be front page news on this would be on Fox. Like this would be a war against Christians because of the cancellation of every single Christian aid contract with the federal government. And so I just mean having this sort of incompetent chaos everywhere throughout the executive branch and the foreign policy apparatus of the United States is having consequences in so many ways that one human being could not track it all. The outrages. It's too much
One
for any.
human being is doing it all. Why could not a group of human beings respond to the one human being doing it all? So I
Oh, for
disagree.
the same reason that it takes longer, I could build a tower out of Legos and a toddler could come and push it over.
Okay, fair.
Like it's way easier to just break things and light things on fire. Building a house takes a while, lighting it, burning it down you can do pretty quickly.
Okay. I got a C in nonverbal communication in college, so I consider myself an expert. So I can tell that teacher Tyler really wants to jump in and ask some questions or make some points. So let's interrupt our own conversation with Ray Tyler.
Thank you, John. I think in the chat I see some other teacher types there commenting too. That's great. I agreed with everything that Dr. Tootle said about what makes an American. That's I've been working on a little essay there that you asked about,
Thank you for
and
doing that.
it comes from the Declaration of Independence, and there's a link between Jefferson in 1776, Lincoln at Gettysburg in 1863, and Martin Luther King in the Washington and the Lincoln Memorial Steps in 1963, and King, it's a self-evident truth in 1776 is a proposition under challenge in 1863. For King, it's a national creed, a part
Right.
of our national religion. I would just add one thing to the ideological. It seems to me that, and Stephen Tootle, you might disagree with this, but it seems to me that other countries have evolved into this sort of Western Europe, perhaps, and Japan, perhaps, but we stated it from the beginning, but we also filtered it through a small R Republican process. And I just came from a seminar on the Constitution with Adam Seagrave, but that what constituted a Republican form of government, there was not a consensus around that. There were different views about what criteria was required, but a republic was not in dispute. We wanted a republic, and I wonder if we still. To me, one of the challenges we've swung too far to a democracy, and how do you make that argument that you want to restrict people's viewpoint so that we can filter it through more representatives? But I would like, since you're talking about Ukraine and Russia, I would like to
You
ask.
want them to answer that, and then before you go to the next question,
Sure.
go ahead, Professor.
Um, I agree, and I do think it's an important point because, even though we would say like it is an important distinction that America was created out of a purely ideological nation state that we would say like, yes, many of them were English, but it was already multinational in a way that no other country was, and that things, that other countries are struggling with as they evolve into ideological nation states. It's hard for Germans to accept non-Germans as being Germans. I can move to France, but they would never consider me French. And in Poland, there's still an identity of who is Polish. So the fact that other nation states evolved out of that tradition we talked about of starting with essentially families, clans, tribes, and nations makes it difficult for them to evolve into an ideological nation state where their national identity doesn't have something to do with ethnicity. And that is an important distinction. So,
Professor,
Uh,
let me interrupt both of you, and then you can get back on track. Professor, I have this instinct that some of the energy behind the Trump movement versus the conservative movement versus Republican, but some of the energy behind the Trump movement is a desire to have a homogeneous kind of state. So I'm not saying it's racist. I just, it does seem like there's a desire that we need to be like other countries. We need to be like Germany or Italy or France or Japan. It seems, and it seems like it's a human trait of wanting to be around people that want to look like you. And that seems to be some among my real friends. I don't think they're racist. It's a different nuance. It's they want to be around people that they view more American than people that have divergent ideas and views and a little bit of skin color, etc. Can you give some nuance on that, or you think I'm on the wrong path and talking to the wrong people?
Well, I would just say that there's a distinction between Trump and Trump supporters. Trump, as I said, critical Trump theory says that all he cares about is whether or not you agree with him, And so if you happen to be black, gay, Latino, whatever, and you agree with him, he loves it. Like he thinks it's great. He'll have his picture taken with you and shake your hand, and you'll get promoted to high office, and Now that's different than now take that theory and remember that if you are a racist and you support Donald Trump, he will accept your support. And he's going to put you on the stage too.
For sure.
it does provide encouragement to people who want to advance that particular agenda, whether it's, and it doesn't really matter what kind of wacko you are. I mean, there's a sex trafficker, pornographer who we're bringing back. I mean, there's our number 2 guy at the FBI is a complete whack job. I mean, and you say, well, but is it racist? Well, I mean, the new FBI director is Kash Patel. Like, he's not what a racist would call a white person, you know. Um, but I mean, there are actual racists in that mix, and that would be absurd to deny it. And he won't condemn them, because he won't condemn his supporters.
Okay, and good enough for now.
Yeah,
Ray, I interrupted you, so go back to your point, and then we'll get to Hope.
I agree with what Stephen said there in response about the other countries. I can't move to Hungary and become an American Hungarian the way, and I'm picking Hungary for a reason, as you know. But also, one other thing about that, though, is, to my knowledge, there's never been a country in the history of the world, even today, that has tried to create a racially, culturally, ethnically diverse community, gender, whatever category you want to put, and say we have equal rights for everybody. Nobody is still really trying to do that.
I agree with that, Ray. Professor, are we wrong?
I mean, I just don't. I think there are a lot of people trying in a lot of countries, and I want to make sure to give them credit.
I mean,
Like,
England, right? England is pretty
yeah, England is
diverse.
doing a pretty good job of trying to redefine what it means to be a member of the British Empire. And
Former colonists.
yeah, but also, like, even though Australia, which has in many ways a more horrific history with their native peoples, but they are also, there are people in Australia who want a full reckoning with all of that and a new definition of what it means to be Australian, and so there are people trying all over the world. So I don't. If the real question is, are there people who are trying? Yeah, there are people who are trying all over the world.
I think that's great. We are number 1. You haven't countered raising my point that we're number 1. USA, we're number 1.
Well, it's different because for us, it was the reason we exist in the first place.
Right.
That's what I was trying to say. When I said the other countries have evolved into trying that.
Yeah, we're not. Yeah, I'm not disagreeing.
That's what I was trying to say.
Okay, Ray, last point if you have one.
Yes, John Quincy Adams, in a famous July 4th speech in 1826, talked about how Americans promote democracy, but we shall, and I may butcher the quote here, but we shall not go abroad seeking monsters to destroy.
Yep.
And it's a real famous line, and there seems to be
always. I missed the point. Say it again.
He said, we support democracy, we believe in democracy everywhere in the world, but we shall not go abroad seeking monsters to destroy. So an example would be, a modern example would be, are we morally obligated because we believe in the equality of all people to go to Russia and try to overthrow Putin? There's always been this tension, and I'd like to hear Dr. Tootle respond to this. There seems to be a tension between American values and American strategic interest.
I would say that John Quincy Adams was one of the most experienced diplomats in America, and from the time of from his childhood, right? He was engaged in diplomatic questions, and John Adams his father was, you'd put him in the top 4, most experienced diplomats from his time. And the formulation of Washington, Hamilton, Adams, and John Quincy Adams, I would summarize, another John Quincy Adams line was about when asked, how do we treat these new democracies, right? Because following America's example, starting in the 1820s, like, what should we do? And I've always found this formulation of John Quincy Adams to also be a really important distinction. He said, we should wish them well, but habits of hierarchy, both military and ecclesiastical, are stamped upon their characters. So how should we approach Mexico, Colombia, right? And you say, well, we should wish them well, but there are cultural things that a country has to go through in order to learn the value of protecting peace. And we have an important role to play. And the most important role we have to play, and this is why I always say American exceptionalism properly understood. American exceptionalism is the idea that the most important thing the United States can do in foreign policy is serve as an example that human beings can govern themselves. And every time we engage in peaceful trade with another country that's trying to do the right thing, what it leads to is this reciprocal relationship where they're seeing the benefits of peace. And it's done a remarkably good job of spreading this idea of peace and human dignity, in that we always point out that no two democracies have ever gone to war with one another, and that means that democracies' economies grow because war is bad for the economy and peace is good for the economy, right? So war is wasted resources, so it does nothing but destroy. It's so I think it's a misunderstanding that people have about the deeper traditions of American foreign policy. And there's a historian named Walter McDougall who wrote a book called Promised Land, Crusader State. And he really crystallized this for me when he summarized what the foreign policy tradition of the United States basically was, that sort of Washington, Hamilton, and in a way, Grant, I think, is sort of underrated. I'm reading a book on Grant's foreign policy right now, and I'm starting to really understand. He got it, and he had a comprehensive view of the United States as an ideological nation state that he was acting out in foreign policy. And it's really remarkable to read about. You'd put people like Theodore Roosevelt, McKinley, basically everybody before Woodrow Wilson. And it's and the way I teach it in my classes is it's sort of a two-prong, that it's unilateralism and American exceptionalism. So the first thing we do in foreign policy is we make sure that we serve as an example that human beings can govern themselves. And as long as we survive, our peaceful relationships with any country that comes along that wants to preserve human dignity is incentivized. And then the next part is unilateralism, which kind of gets a bad rap, but it just means that because our national purpose is different than the national purpose of any other country, especially for most of the history of the United States.
You're making Ray's point.
That we need to be prepared to act alone, because their interests are going to be different. And so for almost
our goal, Professor, our goal is to have other countries be peaceful, prosperous, and free.
You're right. And that is also, and this is something that really emerged out of, even Americans didn't really get this until the experiences of the two World War, that it's actually in our national security interest for other countries to be safe and prosperous and free. So it becomes part of our national, because if another country is safe and prosperous and free, we have nothing to fear from them, right? And because we've both learned the lesson that anything that you take from violence is actually diminishing your national wealth, not increasing your national wealth. So it's unilateralism, American exceptionalism, and the formula that most presidents followed was a combination of ideals and interests. And this is one of the many reasons, and there are many reasons to hate Woodrow Wilson, but it's Woodrow Wilson who comes along and says, no, we're not doing this. But every president practically before Woodrow Wilson, said that, and this is a John Quincy Adams point, that how we treat other countries is a combination of ideals and interests. And the default position is to do nothing. But if something is in keeping with our ideals, that we ask ourselves, the next question we ask ourselves is it in keeping with our interests?
Mhm.
And if it's in keeping with our interests and it's in keeping with our ideals, then we do it. But if we have no interests, even if it's in keeping with our ideals, we stay out. That's what we mean by this. We don't go looking for monsters to, because we might sympathize with a group of people on the other side of the world, but if there's no American interest, we don't do anything but wish them well. You know, so it can be very cold when you see presidents enact this kind of thing, which is, I mean, I always say that Hungarians have every very good reason to not like Dwight Eisenhower, you know, because when they were rising up in 1956, he sort of said, well, it's in keeping with our ideals, but it is not in keeping with our interests in the year 1956 for this to happen, you know, because of what was going on in the Suez. And anyway, 56 was a busy year in foreign policy. So, so we let those freedom fighters die. And that is how a nation needs to constantly evaluate, when do we act? Because one of the other things that that bothers me, and this is another line I got from Steve Miner, that historian of Soviet history. He said, you know, kind of like, you American historians, you think that every sparrow that falls from the sky is somehow the fault of the United States. And you forget that other countries have agency, which means that you can't, I mean, it's weird because you can't blame America for everything that has ever happened in the world. Like, and yet somehow there is this tendency to say, oh, this thing happened, it's our fault. Well, it's not, everything is our fault. And that in its own way is a very chauvinistic way of viewing the history of the world, that to say that when this human rights abuse happens on the other side of the world, that somehow that's America's fault too. You know, like, time is a limited resource, money is a limited resource. We can't do everything at all times. It's you can't be like that movie, Everything Everywhere All at Once, you know.
Professor, let me interrupt again because we're running out of time, but I think Hope probably wants to have a comment or a question or both. So Hope, here's your opportunity. I have one last one if you don't.
Okay. Well, I just have an interesting perspective having a grandfather who fought World War II and a dad who fought in Vietnam. So one of the most popular soldiers coming home from war, right? Totally celebrated and worshiped and thanked. And then my dad, who was, you know, called all kinds of names. And it could be a whole movie. I'm not going to diverge here. It's just interesting perspective, right? So Vietnam, you know, as my dad says, like we shouldn't have even been over there. And if you were boots on the ground, you would have seen how they were going to fight to the death. And it's reminding me of Ukraine. I mean, look at how amazing Ukraine has done. And ideologically, I think these Trump and, you know, Putin underestimate, you know, the power and passion of the individual. Anyway, that's just a comment. My question is this whole, okay, foreign policy similar to, is it the Second Amendment? I'm dyslexic and I'm on meds that cause my memory to go. Is it the Second Amendment about guns?
Yes.
Okay, so just as that was made a long time ago before AR-15s, and that's why we got to maybe adjust our gun regulations, you know, not looking for monsters is a lot different when you don't have nuclear weapons, right? So something that felt way far away back when we were making that, or back when he was saying that, it feels a lot closer when we have nuclear weapons. So it changes. And my question is, based on those two things, don't we have to drastically change our perspective on things that were thought about very methodically and carefully and wisely back then? I mean, we have to rethink things. Times have changed, no?
I'm
Sure.
not sure I got your question. Professor, do you get it?
Yeah, I mean, I disagree with some of the underlying premises, but I can still answer the question. Uh, and in a way that I guess it doesn't matter if you're talking about the Second Amendment or foreign policy. When you understand the underlying principle, that you should know that there probably is something that is analogous, um, and the interests of the United States will change, the threats to the United States will change. I mean, but the underlying principle that says what we should do is we should be constantly thinking about what our interests, what can we do, and that should be debated in a public forum peacefully and hopefully respectfully, or it doesn't even have to be respectfully, but at least peacefully. But the underlying principle is the thing that's important to retain. So,
Right. But would John Quincy Adams go after Russia right now, or no?
Well, you'll
Would
notice.
Russia be a monster? I guess that's a better.
I mean, in a way, let me sound like I'm sympathetic to anybody who's in a position of leadership. Reminded of something that Harry Truman once said, which is that, all of the hard decisions, all of the easy decisions are made before they get to me. So let's pretend like we have a president who's trying to do the right thing. And but I'll contrast two presidents. Harry Truman, who was trying to do the right thing, but was a little bit incompetent, but had some good advisors, but he was overall kind of pointed in the right direction. And Dwight Eisenhower, who was, I would say, both a good president and competent. But they both have to guess. Leadership is about guessing. And in anything involving human beings, you're making a guess as to what the best thing to do is, and you don't get to run it back. So I'm making a guess, about what is best for the United States, and that it is actually in keeping with both our ideals and interests to do what I advocated when I was asked about what to do in Ukraine. But I'm just guessing. And to take Trump if we're taking the sort of best version of Trump, and I would tell you that there are smart Trump supporters who say, I agree with everything you're saying, but I am guessing that Russia would use nuclear weapons, that Putin would use nuclear weapons in order to stay in power. And after assessing that cost, I think that our commitment to Ukraine is too expensive, and therefore we should just stop it now. And we should recognize the reality that that Putin is not going to lose this war. And what we should do now is negotiate some sort of settlement that allows Putin to say he won, and preserve the rest of Ukraine, and because the threat of nuclear war is simply too great to contemplate. So I would just say, that's not an unreasonable.
Yeah, and actually, Professor, made that point better than my pro-Trumpian, anti-Ukrainian. I think that's actually a wise comment. That's a legitimate perspective to have. I don't choose to have.
Right. But I'm trying to illustrate that this is a point where so we're both just guessing.
Yeah.
And we can all. So when we're talking about how do we apply the ancient wisdom of the founders, smart people are going to disagree about what is in the American interest. And smart people are going to disagree about how best to apply these principles. But as a conservative, I would say that or I don't even know if I should use that word anymore, because everybody gets the wrong idea now. But as someone trying to preserve the American system of government and the ideals of the founders, I still think that that wisdom properly applied should be the basis of where we begin our discussions and our disagreements.
Okay, we're basically out of time, but Hope, I want to let you have one more bite at the apple if you have another question or follow up, or you don't have to, but yeah, anything else you'd like to say?
No, I just feel sorry for my fellow conservatives right now because, yeah, they're getting lumped in. And so thank you for making that distinction. I make it as a liberal. I'm not a hyper liberal, but I always make that distinction. I'm not anti Republican or anti conservative. I'm anti MAGA Republican. Well, maybe I shouldn't even say that. Maybe there are, distinctions within MAGA, but I'm feeling pretty terrified for my government. So thank you for being pro keeping our government.
Fair enough. So, Professor, I've got an unfair question for you because it's a big, broad one that we've touched on other shows, but I also want to have it incorporated into this show. A ton of my conservative friends really seem to like a strong man. They think that our American system is weak compared to other dictatorships around the world, and that we're going to lose our democracy unless we can figure out how to make action quick and decisive, and we must have more power vested in the presidency, for example. Congress is nice, but sorry, this is real world stuff, John. We have got to make decisions, and I have some concerns. Not concerns. I think our bent towards authoritarianism is real and serious and is one of the major conflicts in America today, but it doesn't seem like we're talking about it much. Can you just tie in? You may differ with that, but can you tie in some aspect of that in concerns with Hungary or China or Russia or
Yeah.
American authoritarians?
Well, I just think the point that I made earlier about we don't have anyone representing the anti-authoritarian position anymore, because I'm old enough to remember when Tom Friedman, right, Mr. Middle of the Road liberal, was saying that isn't it a shame, that we need to rethink our government because China will be more able to deal with global climate change, and authoritarian governments and authoritarianism might be the best way to combat climate change because democracy is getting in the way of needed environmental reforms around the world. And I mean, at the time, I found that outrageous. Like, I wasn't willing to give up on representative government in order to combat climate change, but a lot of people were. And a lot of them were in the Obama administration, and some of them were in the Clinton administration, and everybody in the Biden administration was kind of on board with this. So I would just say, like,
You're specifically, Professor. I mean, it's not just theory. It's saying we've got to get rid of internal combustion engines. We've got to get rid of gas-powered water heaters and stoves. We've got and we're going to mandate it. We're not going to let a law come in. We're going to do executive
not
aid.
just that, but isn't it a shame that we don't have a dictatorship? I mean, literally,
Benevolent,
the
yeah.
argument was that we
Benevolent
need to have
dictatorship. Yeah.
a dictatorship in order to make these changes. And I would always say, I mean, this is my own snarky point, but I would just be like, so you think it's an existential threat, right? Absolutely, it's going to destroy the world. Say, so then you're for nuclear power. They're like, no, absolutely not. Like, what? What? You're willing to destroy democracy in order to combat climate change, but you won't have nuclear power? Like, somehow democracy or a dictatorship is preferable to a clean energy source that has been safer and cheaper and more effective for the last 50 years. But I guess kind of proves that larger cultural point of this is what you get when you don't teach people to value representative institutions. I mean, I was thinking about this, that sort of the instructions that Dick Cheney gave to his daughter. And I was like, maybe that needs to be put on what we put on T-shirts. And
Remind me.
He said, "Defend the Republic." Dick Cheney has two of the best I mean, actually, my friend Tom, who works at the uh, uh, Army War College, I sometimes quote him because he's also has a couple of these phrases where it's just like he uses
Professor
three words.
Bracino?
Yeah, Professor Bracino. A couple times he'll say something. It's like, wow, that's a really good like 3-word summary of a really important point. But when I was arguing for gay marriage because I was a conservative, you know, Dick Cheney's the one who said freedom means freedom for everyone. And I was like, that's such a perfect summation of what we're for. And then when his daughter sort of says, what should I do? And he says, defend the Republic. Like, if you want to know what to do, like, defend the Republic, like, in everything that means. And
So
I,
one more bite, and then we're way over. I apologize. Thanks for your time today. We need to resist as Americans, because we're Americans, the desire to have a strong
but
dictator
just
or
don't destroy rule of law through your resistance. Because some of the things that I've seen advocated is an abdication of rule of law. And what we need is for people to defend rule of law, and that's also involves teaching people what civil disobedience really means, which means, the right thing to do was to do what those assistant district attorneys did in New York, which is you write your letter and you say, I'm not going to do this. I
you
mean,
resign.
like what was it Václav Havel who said, oh, this is why we need Jake, but quote, let the lie come, but not through me. What is our obligation when we're dealing in a world full of lies? Like, we can't fight everything, but just know that I will not participate in this. Figure out where your lines are. Say, I will not cross this line. And when it comes to that, I will not say it. I will not participate in it. And if it means civil disobedience, arrest me. And if you're using violence, then and rule of law has disintegrated, like, take to the streets. But figure out where those moral lines are. But again, we don't go looking for monsters to destroy in foreign policy or in our, the way we live our lives. And that's one of the reasons why I'm always asking, what are you doing in your neighborhood? Because everybody takes care of their house. I mean, take care of your family, take care of your house, then take care of your neighborhood, then take care of your church, then take care of your friends. And if everybody does that, we're going to be fine.
Yeah, I think that's excellent advice. Yeah, to counter the authoritarian tendencies among ourselves, and how we deal with the world. Professor, last call. Any other one-liners, or are you good with today's conversation?
I don't know. If we print up T-shirts, do we have to pay like Dick Cheney a licensing fee or something?
That's funny.
He couldn't have been the first person to say defend the Republic, right? We wouldn't have to pay him.
Yeah, I don't know. We probably not. In that instance, probably not. Now, if it was Trump that said it, baby, you better pay up the.
Or
Okay.
Disney, right?
All right, Professor, thank you so much for your time today. That was excellent. And I'm sorry not to be more pointed in my questions, but I think we got to most of the thrust so people can make up their own mind.
Yeah, you know how I am.
Yeah. Professor, thank you.
Yeah.
Have a great day, y'all.
Yep. See ya.